The first time Ellen Barrett saw Louis Yates, he was pointing a rifle at her brother's chest, and she was screaming at him to lower it before she did something they would both regret. That was the autumn of 1881, in the dust-blown cattle town of Concho Springs, Texas, a place where the wind carried grit into every crack of every building, and the nights carried the howl of coyotes that sounded, some said, like the cries of men who had died with unfinished business. Ellen was 26 years old then, though she felt older, weighed down as she was by the name she carried, Barrett. Her brother Wade Barrett had made that name feared across 3 counties, a name that made shopkeepers lock their doors and mothers pull their children closer when it was spoken aloud. She had not chosen the name any more than she had chosen the blood that ran through her veins, but in Concho Springs, nobody cared much for the difference between a man who rode with outlaws and a woman who simply happened to share his surname. On that particular morning, the sun had barely cleared the ridge to the east when Wade came galloping into town on a horse lathered white with sweat, 3 men from the Elkhart gang trailing behind him, and a deputy's badge glinting on the chest of the man who chased them all, a man Ellen did not yet know was named Louis Yates. Ellen had been standing outside the dry goods store, a basket of mending balanced on her hip, when the shots rang out. She dropped the basket and ran toward the commotion instinctively, the way she always did when trouble found her brother, which was more often than she cared to admit. By the time she reached the center of town, Wade had been thrown from his horse, his shoulder bleeding through his shirt, and Louis Yates stood over him with his rifle raised, his jaw set like granite, his gray eyes hard as flint. "Don't," Ellen said, stepping between them before she could think better of it. "He's hurt. He's not going anywhere." Louis Yates did not lower the rifle right away. He looked at her instead, taking her measure the way a man might size up a fence he intended to jump. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair escaping its pins and eyes the color of strong coffee, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that told him she was not the kind to be moved by threats. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough from the ride, "your brother has been running with men who robbed the Concho Springs bank not 2 days past. I've got a warrant for his arrest, and I mean to see it done." "Then arrest him," Ellen said. "But you will not shoot a wounded man in the street while I stand here and watch it happen." There was a long moment where nothing moved except the dust settling around them, and then Louis Yates lowered the rifle, slow and deliberate, and holstered his sidearm instead. "I reckon that's fair," he said. It was not fair, not in the way the word was usually meant, because nothing about Ellen Barrett's life in those days was fair. She had spent years cleaning up after Wade's mistakes, paying debts he left behind, offering apologies to people he had wronged, all while trying to build some kind of respectable life for herself in a town that saw her as nothing more than an extension of her brother's sins. She taught the younger children their letters in a 1-room schoolhouse 3 days a week, and she kept the books for the widow Halloran's boarding house the other days, and she went to church every Sunday and sat in the back pew where she could feel the weight of every eye that turned to look at her, wondering if she carried the same rot in her heart that her brother carried in his. Wade was taken to the jail that day, his shoulder bandaged by the town doctor, and Louis Yates stayed on to make sure he did not slip away in the night, because Wade Barrett had slipped away from lesser men before. It was 3 days later, when Ellen brought a plate of food to the jailhouse for her brother, that she spoke to Louis Yates again. "You did not have to bring him food," Louis said, watching her from where he sat at the small desk that served as the deputy's station. "The town provides for prisoners." "The town provides beans and stale bread," Ellen said, setting the plate down on the desk with more force than was strictly necessary. "My brother is many things, Deputy Yates, but he is still my brother, and I will not let him starve while he waits for whatever comes next." Louis studied her for a long moment. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and a scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of some old violence he did not care to discuss. There was a weariness about him that went deeper than the ride he had taken to catch her brother, a weariness that came from years of chasing men who did not want to be caught, through country that did not care whether they lived or died. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "And what did you expect?" "I do not rightly know," he admitted. "Someone harder, maybe. Someone who would not care so much what happened to a man who has caused her so much trouble." Ellen's jaw tightened. "You know nothing about what I care for, Deputy. You know a name on a wanted poster and a brother who shares my blood. That is all." She turned to leave, but Louis rose from his chair, something in his manner suggesting he was not quite ready to let the conversation end. "I meant no offense, Miss Barrett," he said. "I have chased men like your brother for near 10 years now, since I first put on a badge in Kansas. I have seen what it does to the families they leave behind, the ones who did not choose the path but get judged for it all the same. I do not think that is right." Ellen turned back to him, surprised by the admission. It was not what she expected from a lawman, not in a territory where justice was often as rough and unyielding as the land itself. "Then you are a rare sort of deputy," she said. "I try to be," Louis said, "though I do not always succeed." That was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. It was simply a conversation between two people who found themselves on opposite sides of a complicated situation, neither one certain, yet what the other might come to mean to them. Wade Barrett was tried a month later, in a makeshift courtroom set up in the back of the general store, because Concho Springs did not yet have a proper courthouse. The circuit judge who presided over the case was a man named Harlan Voss, known throughout the territory for his harsh sentences and his even harsher temperament. He looked at Wade Barrett the way a man might look at vermin, and he sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison without so much as a moment's hesitation, despite the fact that Wade's role in the bank robbery had been minor, that he had been more follower than leader, more desperate young man looking for a way to feed himself than hardened criminal. Ellen sat in that courtroom and watched her brother's life be decided in less time than it took to boil water for coffee, and something in her broke that day, though it was not grief exactly. It was something closer to rage, a burning conviction that the system meant to deliver justice had failed to look closely enough at the man standing before it, had failed to see the difference between a man who deserved 15 years and a man who deserved a second chance. Louis Yates sat in the back of that same courtroom, having testified earlier about the circumstances of the arrest, and he watched Ellen's face as the sentence was read. He saw something shift in her, some resolve harden into place, and though he did not know it then, he was watching the birth of the woman Concho Springs would one day come to trust above all others. After the sentencing, Ellen approached Judge Voss in the small room that served as his chambers, a converted storage closet with a single window that let in a shaft of dusty light. "Judge Voss," she said, "may I have a word?" Voss looked up from his papers, his expression already impatient. "Miss Barrett, I have heard enough from your family for one lifetime. With respect, sir, you have heard almost nothing from my family. You heard testimony about my brother's actions, but you did not hear about the drought that took our father's farm 3 years past, or the debts that drove Wade to desperation, or the fact that he has never once raised a hand against another living soul in the commission of any crime he has been accused of. 15 years is a sentence fit for a man who has taken life, not one who took money he should not have taken. The law does not concern itself with a man's reasons, Miss Barrett. Only with his actions." "Then perhaps the law is missing something important," Ellen said, and the words surprised her even as she spoke them, because she had never before considered herself someone who might question the law itself, only someone who suffered beneath its weight. Voss's eyes narrowed. "You would do well to remember your place, young woman. The law is not yours to question." "Someone ought to question it," Ellen said, "if it cannot tell the difference between a wolf and a rabbit that got caught running with wolves." She left his chambers with her heart pounding, uncertain whether she had accomplished anything beyond making an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory's judicial system, but something had shifted inside her nonetheless. A seed had been planted, though it would take years to bloom. Wade was sent to the territorial prison in Yuma, and Ellen wrote to him faithfully every week, though his replies came less and less frequently as the months turned into years. She continued her work in the schoolhouse and at the boarding house, and she began, almost without realizing it, to spend more time in conversation with Louis Yates, who remained in Concho Springs as the town's permanent deputy after the previous one retired to a small ranch outside of town. Their friendship grew slowly, built on shared meals at the boarding house where Louis took his supper most evenings, and on long conversations after church on Sundays when the rest of the congregation had dispersed, and only the two of them remained, talking about everything from the price of cattle to the books Ellen had read as a girl, back when her family still had a home worth having books in. It was during one of these Sunday conversations, nearly a year after Wade's sentencing, that Louis first asked Ellen about her interest in the law. "You have been reading Judge Voss's old law books," he observed, noting the well-worn volume tucked beneath her arm. "I have seen you carrying them for months now." Ellen flushed slightly, unaccustomed to having her private study noticed. "I borrowed them from the schoolhouse library. Someone donated a collection years ago, before I ever came to Concho Springs. I find them interesting." "Interesting how?" "I want to understand how it works," Ellen said, choosing her words carefully. "The law, I mean. How a man can be sentenced to 15 years for a crime that another man, in another courtroom, might receive 5 years for. How judges decide what a person deserves. I want to understand it well enough to challenge it, if I ever get the chance." Louis studied her with an expression she could not quite read. "That is an unusual ambition for a woman in this territory." "Is it more unusual than a woman raising her brother's debts, or teaching children their letters, or keeping books for a boarding house while wondering if she will ever have a life that is entirely her own?" Ellen asked, an edge creeping into her voice. "I have spent my whole life being defined by what others decide I am allowed to be. I would like for once to decide something for myself." "I did not mean to discourage you," Louis said quickly. "I only meant that it is unusual, not that it is wrong. I think you would make a fine student of the law, Miss Barrett. I have watched you argue with Judge Voss's clerk about points of procedure that would confound most men in this town." Ellen's anger softened slightly. "You watched that?" "I watch a great many things," Louis said, and there was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely, something that suggested his attention to her went beyond simple curiosity about her legal studies. It was not long after this conversation that Concho Springs found itself without a justice of the peace, the previous one having moved east to be closer to his ailing mother. The town council, faced with the prospect of relying entirely on the circuit judges' infrequent visits to handle even minor disputes, decided to appoint someone local to fill the role, at least until a more permanent solution could be found. Ellen applied for the position, to the shock of nearly everyone in town, including, she would later admit, herself. The town council met in the back room of the saloon, since it was the largest space available that was not currently occupied by livestock or dry goods, and Ellen stood before them with her chin held high and her hands folded in front of her, refusing to let them see how her heart hammered against her ribs. "Miss Barrett," said Councilman Prout, an older man with a mustache stained yellow from tobacco, "you understand that this position requires a certain degree of legal knowledge and a reputation for fairness that the town can trust." "I understand perfectly, Councilman," Ellen said. "I have spent the past year studying every law book I could find, and I have sat through every court proceeding held in this town since my arrival. As for my reputation, I would ask the council to judge me on my own actions and character, not on the actions of my brother, whose choices were his own and not mine to answer for." "Your brother is an outlaw," said another councilman, a thin man named Higgins who ran the feed store. "Serving time in the territorial prison for robbery. How can the town trust the sister of a criminal to sit in judgment over honest citizens?" Ellen felt the old anger rising in her chest, the familiar sting of being defined by Wade's mistakes rather than her own choices. But she forced herself to remain calm, to answer with the reasoned voice she had practiced in countless imagined conversations just like this one. "Mr. Higgins," she said, "if we judged every person in this territory by the actions of their relatives, none of us would escape condemnation. I have watched this town's justice system fail to distinguish between men who deserve mercy and men who deserve punishment. I watched a judge sentence my brother to 15 years without once considering the circumstances that drove him to desperation. I do not say this to excuse his crime, but to illustrate a point. Justice that does not consider the full measure of a person and the full measure of their circumstances is not justice at all. It is merely punishment, and punishment without understanding breeds only more suffering, more desperation, more crime." The room fell silent for a long moment. Louis Yates, who had been asked to attend the meeting as the town's law enforcement representative, stood near the back wall, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes never left Ellen's face. "That is a fine speech, Miss Barrett," Councilman Prout said finally, "but fine speeches do not make a fine judge. What assurance can you offer this council that you would rule with a clear head, uninfluenced by sympathy for those who might remind you of your brother?" Ellen took a breath, steadying herself. "I can offer you my word, and I can offer you this. I have lived my entire adult life under the shadow of judgment I did not deserve. I know, better than most, the difference between mercy that is earned and mercy that is merely excused. I will not coddle criminals, councilman. But I will look at every case that comes before me with the full weight of its circumstances, and I will not hand down sentences simply because it is easier than considering the alternative." It was Louis who spoke next, stepping forward from the wall where he had been standing. "If the council will permit me," he said, "I would like to offer my own assessment as the town's deputy. I have known Miss Barrett for over a year now, and in that time I have watched her conduct herself with more integrity than most men I have known in my years wearing this badge. She has studied the law diligently. She understands the weight of the responsibility she seeks, and I believe, without reservation, that she would serve this town well." The council deliberated for the better part of an hour, and in the end, by a narrow margin, they voted to appoint Ellen Barrett as the Justice of the Peace for Concho Springs, a decision that would prove, in the years to come, to be one of the most important the council would ever make. Ellen's first case as Justice of the Peace came only 2 weeks after her appointment, and it set the tone for everything that would follow. A young man named Timothy Sawyer, barely 19 years old, had been caught stealing a side of bacon from the general store, driven to it by hunger after his father's death had left him and his younger siblings without income or provisions. The store owner, a hard man named Otis Blackwood, wanted the boy sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under territorial law, which could have meant months in the county jail. Ellen listened to the testimony from both sides, her face impassive as she weighed the evidence, though her heart ached at the sight of the young man standing before her, thin and frightened, clearly more desperate than criminal. "Mr. Sawyer," she said finally, "you have committed a theft, and that cannot go unpunished. But I have also heard testimony that you have 3 younger siblings depending on you, and that you sought work at every establishment in this town before resorting to theft, without success. Is this true?" "Yes, Your Honor," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did not want to steal. I did not know what else to do. My little sister had not eaten in 2 days. Ellen looked at Otis Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood, would you be willing to accept restitution in the form of labor, rather than seeing this young man sent to jail, where he could offer no support to his siblings at all?" Blackwood grumbled, clearly displeased at having his desired punishment softened, but he was also a practical man, and the prospect of free labor at his store appealed to him more than the satisfaction of seeing a boy locked away. "I suppose I could use an extra hand," he said grudgingly. "Then it is settled," Ellen said. Timothy Sawyer, you will work for Mr. Blackwood without pay beyond what covers the cost of the bacon you took for a period of 2 months. During that time, I expect you to seek other employment as well, so that you may properly provide for your family. If I hear of any further theft, the leniency of this ruling will not be extended a second time. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. The courtroom, such as it was, murmured with surprise at the ruling, unaccustomed to a judge who considered circumstance alongside crime. But as word spread through Concho Springs of the fair and thoughtful judgment Ellen had rendered, something began to shift in the way the town regarded her. Louis Yates, who had attended the hearing in his official capacity, found himself smiling as he watched Ellen step down from the makeshift bench, a smile he did not bother to hide when their eyes met across the room. "You did well," he said, catching up to her as she gathered her papers. "I hope so," Ellen said. "It is one thing to study the law in books, and quite another to apply it to a frightened boy who reminds you so much of your own brother." "That is precisely why you will make a fine judge," Louis said, "because you remember what it means to be judged unfairly, and you will not inflict that same unfairness on others." Their friendship deepened over the following months, as Ellen settled into her role and Louis continued his work maintaining order in Concho Springs, a job that grew more demanding as the town's population swelled with the arrival of new settlers drawn by the promise of cheap land and the eastward expansion of the railroad. It was during this period, in the spring of 1883, that Ellen and Louis found themselves spending increasing amounts of time together, not merely as colleagues navigating the demands of law and order in a growing frontier town, but as something closer to friends, and eventually, as something closer still. They took to walking together after Sunday services, following the creek that ran along the edge of town, talking about everything and nothing, the comfortable silence between them as meaningful as their conversation. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Louis asked her one such Sunday, as they walked along the creek bank, the spring wildflowers blooming purple and yellow among the grass. "Leaving Concho Springs?" Ellen asked, surprised by the question. "Why would I leave? This is my home now." "I only wondered," Louis said, "given everything you have endured here, the whispers about your brother, the doubts about your fitness for the position you hold, I would think sometimes that a fresh start elsewhere might be tempting." Ellen considered this for a long moment. "I thought about it once. In the early days, after Wade was sentenced, I considered packing up and moving somewhere no one knew our name, somewhere I could simply be Ellen, without the weight of being Wade Barrett's sister following me everywhere I went." "What changed your mind?" "I realized that running would not change anything," Ellen said. "It would only mean I had let the whispers win, let them decide who I was allowed to be. I would rather stay and prove them wrong than run and let them be right. Besides," she added, glancing sideways at him, "I have found reasons to stay that I did not expect to find." Louis' step slowed slightly, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And what reasons might those be?" Ellen felt her cheeks warm, but she did not look away. "I think you know the answer to that, Deputy Yates." It was Louis who closed the distance between them then, his hand finding hers as they stood beside the creek, the water burbling softly over smooth stones, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. "Ellen," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name rather than the formal address he had always employed before. "I have thought of little else besides you since the day I first saw you standing between me and your brother's rifle, ready to defend him even against a lawman with a warrant in hand. I have watched you become something remarkable in this town, something I do not think you yet realize you have become. And I find that I do not wish to spend my Sundays walking with anyone else, nor my evenings taking supper with anyone else, nor my future imagining any life that does not include you in it." Ellen's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Louis," she said softly, "are you telling me you love me?" "I am telling you exactly that," Louis said. "I love you, Ellen Barrett, more than I have ever loved anything or anyone in my 32 years on this earth. And I would be honored beyond measure if you would consider allowing me to court you properly, with the intention of one day making you my wife, should you find yourself willing to have me." Ellen felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, tears born not of sadness, but of a joy so profound it nearly overwhelmed her. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of love, believing that Wade's crimes had tainted her too thoroughly for any decent man to want her, and yet here stood Louis Yates, a man of unimpeachable character, telling her that he loved her without reservation. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Louis, I would be honored to let you court me. I love you as well. I think I have loved you for longer than I dared admit, even to myself." Louis's face broke into a smile that transformed his usually serious features entirely, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "Then I am the luckiest man in the territory," he said. They stood together beside the creek as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ellen felt entirely, completely happy. Their courtship proceeded with the kind of careful propriety expected in a frontier town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where a woman's reputation, particularly a woman in Ellen's position, could be irreparably damaged by even the smallest hint of impropriety. Louis called on her at the boarding house each Sunday after church, and they took their meals together in the boarding house dining room, always within sight of the widow Halloran, who served as an unofficial chaperone and who, Ellen suspected, delighted in the romance blossoming before her eyes. News of their courtship spread through Concho Springs quickly, as news of everything did in a town so small, and the reaction was mixed. Some residents thought it a fine match, two respected figures in the community finding happiness together. Others muttered that Louis Yates could do better than an outlaw's sister, regardless of how well she had performed in her role as justice of the peace. Ellen heard these whispers, of course, and they stung, but she found that Louis's steady presence beside her made them easier to bear than they had been in the days before their courtship began. "Let them talk," Louis told her one evening, as they sat on the boarding house porch after supper, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. "Their talk does not change what I know to be true about you." "It is not so easy for me to ignore," Ellen admitted. "I have spent my whole life trying to prove I am more than Wade's sister, and yet the whispers persist regardless of what I accomplish." "Then perhaps we ought to give them something new to whisper about," Louis said, and there was a playful glint in his eye that made Ellen laugh despite herself. "And what might that be?" "Our wedding, perhaps, once you have consented to have me properly." Ellen's laughter faded into something softer, more tender. "Is that a proposal, Deputy Yates?" "Not yet," Louis said. "When I propose to you, Ellen Barrett, I intend to do it properly, with all the ceremony such an important question deserves. But I wanted you to know that it is coming, so that you might prepare your answer in advance." "I do not need to prepare an answer," Ellen said. "I have known my answer since the day you told me you loved me." It was 3 months later, on a warm evening in late summer, that Louis finally asked the question properly. He had arranged for them to have a picnic supper beside the same creek where they had first spoken of their feelings, and as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink across the Texas sky, he knelt before her with a small ring he had commissioned from the town's blacksmith, a simple band of gold with a small garnet stone that caught the last light of day. "Ellen Barrett," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness Ellen could see in his eyes, "I have loved you since the moment you stood between me and your brother's rifle, unafraid to defend what you believed was right even against a man with the full authority of the law behind him. I have watched you build a life of honor and integrity in a town that doubted you at every turn, and I have come to believe that there is no one in this world I would rather share my life with. Will you marry me?" Ellen's tears fell freely now, tears of pure joy that she made no attempt to hide. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Louis, I will marry you. 1,000 times yes." They were married the following month, in a small ceremony held in the Concho Springs church, with the widow Halloran serving as matron of honor and Louis's fellow deputy from a neighboring town standing as best man. The whole town turned out for the celebration afterward, held in the same saloon back room where Ellen had once stood before the council pleading her case to become justice of the peace, and even those who had once whispered doubts about her found themselves raising a glass in celebration of the union. It was during the wedding celebration that a letter arrived, carried by the evening stage, addressed to Ellen in handwriting she recognized immediately as her brother's. She read it later that night, after the celebration had wound down and she and Louis had retired to the small house they had purchased on the edge of town, a modest but sturdy structure that would serve as their first home together. The letter was brief, but its contents struck Ellen with the force of a physical blow. Wade wrote that he had been granted early release from the territorial prison, his sentence reduced for good behavior, and for information he had provided regarding other members of the Elkhart gang who remained at large. He was to be released within the month, and he intended to travel to Concho Springs to see his sister, though he understood if she no longer wished to have anything to do with him, given how much time had passed and how much her life had changed. Ellen showed the letter to Louis, her hands trembling slightly as she did so. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Louis considered the letter carefully before responding. "I think you should see him, if that is what your heart tells you to do. He is still your brother, Ellen, whatever else he might be. But I also think you should be prepared for the possibility that prison has not changed him, that he might return to old habits despite whatever good behavior earned him his release." "I know," Ellen said softly, "but I have to see him. I have to know what kind of man he has become." Wade Barrett arrived in Concho Springs 3 weeks later, and Ellen was there at the stage depot to meet him, her heart caught somewhere between hope and dread as she watched him step down from the coach. He looked older than his years, his face weathered by prison life in ways that spoke of hardship she could only imagine, but there was something different in his eyes as well, something that had not been there before his imprisonment, a kind of weariness that seemed less like defeat and more like reflection. "Ellen," he said, his voice catching as he approached her, "I did not know if you would come." "You are my brother," Ellen said. "Of course I came." They embraced, and Ellen felt years of accumulated grief and worry release from her chest, though she remained cautious, uncertain what to expect from this new version of her brother. "You look well," Wade said, studying her. "Better than well. I heard in prison that you had become the justice of the peace here in town. I could hardly believe it when the letter reached me. My little sister, a judge." "A lot has changed since you left," Ellen said. "I have married as well, Louis Yates, the deputy who arrested you all those years ago." Wade's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he did not seem displeased by the news. "Yates seemed a fair man, as I recall, even as he was putting me in irons. I am glad you found happiness, Ellen, truly. You deserve it, after everything you sacrificed for me." They talked for hours that evening at the small house Ellen shared with Louis, catching up on years of separation, and Wade spoke, hesitantly at first and then more openly, about his time in prison, about the men he had met there, about the ways the experience had forced him to reckon with the choices that had led him down such a destructive path. "I do not expect forgiveness," Wade said at one point, looking down at his hands rather than at his sister's face. "I know what I put you through, the debts, the shame, the years of watching this town judge you for my sins. I cannot take that back, no matter how much I might wish to." "I have already forgiven you," Ellen said. "I forgave you long ago, Wade. What I want to know now is what you intend to do with the second chance you have been given." Wade looked up at her then, and something in his expression suggested he had been waiting for this question, perhaps even hoping for it. "I would like to stay here if you would allow it. Build a life, an honest one this time. I learned a trade in prison, working with leather, and I thought I might open a shop here in Concho Springs if the town would have me." Louis, who had been listening quietly from across the room, spoke up then. "The town has changed a great deal since you left, Wade." There are many who remember your crimes, and it will not be easy to earn their trust. But if you are willing to work honestly, and if you are willing to prove yourself through your actions rather than your words, I believe there is room here for a man seeking redemption." Wade nodded, his jaw set with a determination that reminded Ellen of their father, a man who had faced his own share of hardship without ever losing his sense of purpose. "I am willing to work for it," he said, "whatever it takes." True to his word, Wade Barrett set about establishing himself as an honest tradesman in Concho Springs, opening a small leather shop that specialized in saddles, boots, and other goods essential to the ranching community that surrounded the town. It was slow work at first, as many townspeople remained wary of doing business with a former outlaw, but Wade's craftsmanship was undeniable, and gradually, one customer at a time, he began to earn the trust that had once seemed impossible to reclaim. Ellen watched her brother's transformation with a mixture of pride and cautious hope, and she found that having him nearby, living an honest life, healed something in her that she had not realized remained broken. Life in Concho Springs continued to evolve over the following years, as the town grew from a rough cattle crossing into something approaching a proper frontier settlement, complete with a permanent courthouse, a growing school that Ellen continued to support even after she could no longer teach there herself due to the demands of her judicial role, and a population that had swelled to include families from all across the eastern states. Drawn by the promise of land and opportunity that the Western territories still offered, Ellen's reputation as justice of the peace grew alongside the town itself, and she became known throughout the region for her fair-minded rulings, her willingness to consider the full circumstances of every case that came before her, and her refusal to be swayed by wealth, status, or reputation when weighing questions of guilt and punishment. Ranchers and farmers, cowboys and shopkeepers all came to trust that when they stood before Ellen Barrett's bench, they would receive a judgment based on truth and fairness rather than favoritism or prejudice. It was during this period, in the winter of 1885, that Ellen faced perhaps the most difficult case of her judicial career, one that would test not only her professional integrity but her personal relationships as well. A wealthy rancher named Cornelius Ashford, who owned the largest spread in the county and wielded considerable influence throughout the territory, brought suit against a small homesteading family named the Kellermans, claiming they had illegally fenced off a section of land that rightfully belonged to his ranch, land that included access to a crucial water source. The Kellermans, a young couple named Hans and Greta Kellerman with 3 small children, insisted that the land had been properly claimed under the Homestead Act, and that Ashford's claim to the water rights was based on a survey that predated their legal filing. Ellen studied the case files carefully, reviewing survey documents and homestead records with the meticulous attention that had become her trademark, and it became clear to her that the Kellerman's claim was legitimate, that Ashford's attempt to reclaim the land was based on outdated documentation that no longer held legal standing. But Cornelius Ashford was not a man accustomed to losing, and he made his displeasure known throughout the town in the days leading up to the hearing, hinting darkly that Ellen's judgment would need to align with his interests, or else he would use his considerable influence to see that she was removed from her position. "He came to see me at the shop," Wade told Ellen one evening, when he stopped by her house for supper as had become his custom. "Ashford, I mean. He wanted me to speak with you, to convince you that ruling against him would be a mistake, given how much business he brings to this town." "And what did you tell him?" Ellen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I told him that my sister does not take bribes, veiled or otherwise, and that if he wished to influence her ruling, he ought to consider presenting stronger evidence rather than intimidation." Ellen smiled at her brother's response, warmed by the loyalty he had shown, loyalty that stood in stark contrast to the desperate young man who had once dragged her into scandal and shame. "Thank you for that," she said. "You do not need to thank me for standing up for what is right," Wade said. "I spent enough years standing on the wrong side of that line. I intend to spend whatever years I have left standing on the correct one, starting with defending my sister's integrity against men who think their money entitles them to bend the law." Louis, too, found himself drawn into the tension surrounding the case, as several of Ashford's ranch hands began making pointed comments in the saloon about what might happen to a deputy's career if his wife continued to make enemies of powerful men. "They are trying to intimidate you through me," Louis told Ellen, his expression grim, "suggesting that my position might be at risk if you do not rule in Ashford's favor." "And what do you think I should do?" Ellen asked. Louis took her hands in his gray eyes steady and sure. "I think you should rule according to the law and the evidence, exactly as you always have. I did not marry a woman who bends to threats, Ellen, and I would not respect myself if I asked you to become one now. Whatever consequences might come from ruling against Ashford, we will face them together." The day of the hearing arrived, and the small courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with townspeople crowding the doorway and windows to witness what had become the most talked-about case in Concho Springs history. Cornelius Ashford sat with his lawyer, a slick attorney brought in from Fort Worth, both of them exuding the confidence of men who expected to win regardless of the evidence presented. Ellen listened to both sides present their cases, her expression carefully neutral, giving away nothing of her thoughts as the arguments unfolded. Ashford's lawyer presented an old survey map, claiming it established his client's prior claim to the disputed land, while the Kellermans, represented by a young lawyer who had recently arrived in town and taken their case despite having little to gain financially from it, presented their homestead documentation and testimony from the land office confirming their legal filing. When the arguments concluded, Ellen rose from her seat, and the courtroom fell silent in anticipation of her ruling. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties in this case," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily to every corner of the crowded room. "Mr. Ashford's survey, while historically accurate at the time it was conducted, has been superseded by subsequent land office filings that establish the Kellerman family's legal claim to the disputed property, filings that were properly registered and have not been challenged through appropriate legal channels until this suit was brought." She paused, looking directly at Ashford, whose face had begun to redden with barely controlled anger. "This court finds in favor of the Kellerman family. Their claim to the land and the water rights associated with it is legally sound and shall be upheld. Mr. Ashford's suit is dismissed." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some of surprise, others of satisfaction at seeing a powerful man's attempt at intimidation fail before the law. Ashford stormed from the courthouse without another word, his lawyer trailing behind him, while the Kellermans embraced each other in relief, tears of gratitude streaming down Greta Kellerman's face. "Thank you, Your Honor," Hans Kellerman said, approaching Ellen after the courtroom had begun to clear. "We did not know what we would do if we lost that land. It is everything to our family." "I ruled according to the law, Mr. Kellerman," Ellen said, "nothing more, nothing less. The law protected your claim, and I was simply the instrument through which that protection was realized." But the ruling did not come without consequence, as Louis had predicted it might. 2 weeks after the hearing, Louis received notice that his position as deputy was being reviewed by the town council, with several members suggesting that his marriage to Ellen created a conflict of interest that compromised the integrity of law enforcement in Concho Springs. Ellen was furious when she learned of the review, recognizing immediately that Ashford's influence lay behind the sudden scrutiny of her husband's position. "This is my fault," she told Louis as they sat together in their kitchen, the review notice spread on the table between them. "If I had ruled differently, Ashford would not be seeking retaliation against you." "You did not do anything wrong," Louis said firmly. "You ruled according to justice, exactly as you should have. If Ashford wishes to punish me for that, then let him try. I have served this town honorably for years, and I will not be intimidated by a wealthy rancher's petty vengeance." The town council meeting to review Louis's position drew nearly as large a crowd as Ellen's courthouse ruling had, with residents packing the saloon's back room once again, this time to witness whether Ashford's influence could succeed in punishing a man for his wife's judicial integrity. But something unexpected happened during that meeting, something that would ultimately vindicate both Ellen's ruling and Louis's position. Several members of the community, including many who had never previously spoken up at council meetings, rose to defend both Ellen and Louis, recounting stories of fair treatment, of debts forgiven when circumstances warranted, of criminals appropriately punished when their crimes demanded it, of a justice system that had, for the first time in the town's history, felt genuinely fair to all who encountered it. Even Otis Blackwood, the store owner from Ellen's very first case, stood to speak on her behalf. "I did not agree with Judge Barrett's ruling in that early case with young Sawyer," he admitted. "I wanted that boy punished harshly for stealing from my store. But I have watched him grow into an honest young man these past years, working steadily, providing for his siblings, never once returning to crime. Judge Barrett saw something in that situation that I could not see at the time, and she was right to show mercy where mercy was warranted. I trust her judgment, and I trust that her husband serves this town with equal integrity." The council, moved by the outpouring of community support, voted unanimously to retain Louis in his position, effectively ending Ashford's attempt at retaliation and further solidifying both Ellen's and Louis's standing within the community they had come to serve. Ashford, recognizing that his influence in Concho Springs had reached its limits, eventually relocated his primary business interests to a neighboring county, leaving the town largely free of his manipulative influence, though he continued to hold his original ranch property for several more years before eventually selling it entirely. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after this trial by fire, as Ellen and Louis's marriage strengthened through the shared adversity they had weathered together, and Wade's leather shop continued to grow in reputation and success, eventually employing 2 additional craftsmen to help meet the demand for his quality goods. It was in the spring of 1886, nearly 3 years after their wedding, that Ellen discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled both her and Louis with a joy that seemed to make the entire world brighter. "A child," Louis said when Ellen first told him the news, his voice thick with emotion as he pulled her into his arms. "Ellen, this is everything I have ever wanted." "Are you frightened?" Ellen asked, resting her head against his chest. "I confess I am somewhat. I have never imagined myself as a mother." "I think you will be a wonderful mother," Louis said. "You have spent years caring for this entire town, ensuring fairness and justice for everyone who comes before you. I cannot imagine anyone more suited to raising a child with compassion and integrity than you." Their son, whom they named Thomas after Louis's father, was born in the depths of winter, on a cold January morning when the ground outside was blanketed in a rare Texas snow that seemed to hush the entire world into stillness. Ellen labored through the night with the assistance of the town midwife, while Louis paced anxiously in the next room, and when finally the child's cry pierced the quiet morning air, both parents wept with a happiness that transcended words. Wade, who had been waiting nervously alongside Louis throughout the long night, was the first to hold his nephew after Louis, and something in his weathered face softened as he looked down at the tiny bundle in his arms. "He is beautiful," Wade said softly. "You have given this world something good, Ellen, something that deserves every chance at happiness that you can provide." "We will provide it together," Ellen said, exhausted but glowing with joy. "All of us, this family." Thomas Yates grew quickly, as children do, filling the small house with laughter and the particular chaos that comes with raising an energetic toddler. And 2 years after his birth, Ellen and Louis welcomed a daughter as well, whom they named Sarah after Ellen's mother, who had passed away years before Ellen ever arrived in Concho Springs. The town continued to grow and prosper throughout these years, and Ellen's role as Justice of the Peace expanded alongside it, eventually earning her a formal appointment as county judge when the territorial government reorganized the local court system in 1889. She was, by that time, widely regarded throughout the region as one of the most fair and capable judges in the entire territory, her reputation extending well beyond the borders of Concho Springs to neighboring counties, where lawyers and litigants alike spoke of her rulings with respect and admiration. It was during this period that Ellen finally received closure on the question that had shaped so much of her early life in Concho Springs, the question of her brother's redemption and the town's willingness to accept it. Wade had continued to build his leather goods business into one of the most respected trades in the county, and in 1890, nearly a decade after his original crime, he was asked to serve on the very town council that had once debated whether to trust his sister with the position of Justice of the Peace. It was a request that moved Ellen deeply when she learned of it, recognizing in it the full circle of redemption that both she and her brother had traveled since those difficult early days. "Can you believe it?" Wade asked her when he came to share the news, his expression a mixture of disbelief and quiet pride. "Me, on the town council. The same council that once called me nothing but an outlaw." "I can believe it," Ellen said, embracing her brother warmly. "You have earned this, Wade. Every bit of trust you have rebuilt in this town, you have earned through years of honest work and genuine change. I am so proud of you." "I could not have done it without you," Wade said. "You gave me a reason to believe I could become someone better than what I had been. Watching you fight for fairness, for justice, for the belief that people deserve to be judged by their actions rather than their past mistakes, it showed me what was possible if I was willing to put in the work to change." That same year, Wade married a young widow named Constance Mayer, who had come to Concho Springs with her young daughter after her first husband's death in a ranching accident, and who had fallen in love with Wade's quiet dignity and evident devotion to his craft. Ellen stood beside her brother at his wedding, just as he had once stood beside her at hers, and she felt a profound sense of completion, watching the family she had fought so hard to preserve finally find its full measure of happiness and stability. The years continued to pass in this manner, filled with the ordinary rhythms of frontier life, punctuated by moments of both hardship and joy that Ellen and Louis navigated together with the strength of a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. In 1893, Concho Springs faced one of its greatest challenges when a severe drought threatened the livelihood of nearly every rancher and farmer in the region, bringing with it economic hardship that tested the fabric of the community in ways that had not been seen since the town's earliest days. Ellen's court found itself increasingly occupied with disputes arising from the drought's pressures, families unable to meet their debts, disagreements over dwindling water resources, and the general desperation that accompanies economic hardship in a community with little margin for error. It was during this crisis that Ellen's judicial philosophy, developed over more than a decade of service, proved most valuable to the community she served. Rather than applying rigid punishments to those who fell behind on debts or engaged in minor disputes born of desperation, she worked with the local bank and merchants to establish payment plans and grace periods that allowed struggling families to maintain their dignity and their property while working toward eventual solvency. "You are not merely a judge," Louis told her one evening, as they sat together reviewing the day's cases at their kitchen table, Thomas and Sarah already asleep in their beds. "You have become something like a shepherd for this entire community, guiding people through hardship with wisdom rather than simply enforcing rules without regard for circumstance." "I learned that lesson from my own hardship," Ellen said. "From watching this town judge me and my brother without any consideration for the circumstances that shaped our choices. I refused to perpetuate that same blindness in my own rulings. The drought eventually broke in the autumn of 1893, bringing with it rains that revived the parched land and restored hope to a community that had weathered nearly 2 years of hardship together. The shared struggle had, in many ways, strengthened the bonds within Concho Springs, as neighbors who had helped each other through difficult times found themselves more closely connected than they had been before the crisis began. Ellen and Louis's own family continued to grow during this period as well, with the birth of their third child, a son they named William, born in 1894, followed by their fourth child, a daughter named Margaret, born in 1897. Their household, once so quiet and uncertain in those early days of courtship, had transformed into a bustling home filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the warmth of a large and loving family, and the deep, abiding love between two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to build a life of purpose and joy. As the 1890s drew to a close, Concho Springs had transformed from the rough cattle crossing it had been when Ellen first arrived into a proper town, complete with a permanent brick courthouse, several churches representing different denominations, a growing school system that now included a secondary program for older students, and a population that had grown to nearly 2,000 residents. Drawn by the stability and fairness that had become the town's hallmark reputation throughout the territory. Much of that reputation, everyone in the region agreed, could be traced directly to the judicial integrity that Barrett Yates had brought to Concho Springs' court system, a reputation that had made the town a model for fair and compassionate justice throughout the Western territories. In 1898, as Ellen approached her 43rd year, she was asked to speak at the Territorial Judicial Conference held in Austin, an honor that recognized her decades of service and the innovative approaches to justice she had pioneered in her small frontier courtroom. Louis accompanied her on the journey, proud beyond words to watch his wife receive the recognition she had long deserved, but had never sought for its own sake. "I never imagined, when I first came to Concho Springs," Ellen told the assembled judges and lawyers at the conference, "that I would one day stand before such a distinguished gathering to speak about justice. I came to this territory carrying the weight of my brother's crimes, judged by many before I ever had the chance to prove my own character. That experience taught me something I believe is essential to true justice, something I have tried to embody throughout my years on the bench. Justice is not merely the application of rules without consideration for the humanity of those who stand before us. It is the careful weighing of circumstance, character, and consequence, always in service of not merely punishing wrongdoing, but of helping people find their way toward becoming better versions of themselves. I have watched a young man who stole out of desperation grow into an honest and productive member of his community. I have watched my own brother, once condemned as nothing more than an outlaw, rebuild his life through years of dedicated, honest work, until he became a trusted voice on our town council. These transformations did not happen because the law punished them harshly, but because the law, applied with wisdom and compassion, gave them the opportunity to prove who they truly were, beneath the mistakes that had once defined them. The speech was met with enthusiastic applause, and in the years that followed, several of the judicial reforms Ellen had championed in her small frontier courtroom began to influence broader discussions about criminal justice throughout the territory, as more judges began to consider circumstance and potential for rehabilitation, alongside strict punishment for crimes committed. Ellen and Louis returned to Concho Springs from that conference with a renewed sense of purpose, and they continued their work in the town they had helped shape for another decade, watching their children grow into adulthood, watching Wade's leather business expand into a respected regional enterprise that employed a dozen craftsmen, watching the town itself mature into a permanent and thriving community that stood as testament to what fairness and compassion could accomplish. even in the harshest and most unforgiving corners of the frontier. Thomas Yates, their eldest son, followed in his mother's footsteps and studied law, eventually becoming a respected attorney who often argued cases before his own mother's court, a situation that provided the family with considerable amusement and pride in equal measure. Sarah grew into a talented schoolteacher, following in the profession her mother had once practiced before becoming a judge, while William developed a passion for ranching and eventually took over management of a modest cattle operation on land the family had purchased outside of town. Margaret, the youngest, showed an early talent for medicine, and, in a testament to how much the Western territories had changed since Ellen's own youth, was able to pursue formal medical training, eventually returning to Concho Springs to serve as the town's physician, working alongside the aging doctor who had once treated Wade's shoulder wound so many years before. In 1905, as Ellen approached her 50th year, the town of Concho Springs honored her with a ceremony marking her 25th year of judicial service, a celebration that drew residents from across the county to the newly built town hall, where a portrait of Ellen was unveiled to hang alongside the founders of the town, a recognition of the profound impact she had made on the community's development and character. Louis stood beside her throughout the ceremony, his hair now touched with gray, his face lined with the years of shared life and love that had passed since that first fateful encounter beside her brother's wounded body in the dusty street of Concho Springs. When the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse into the warm evening air, he took her hand in his, just as he had done so many times over the past 22 years of marriage. "Do you remember," he said, "when I first pointed my rifle at your brother, and you stepped between us without a moment's hesitation?" "I remember," Ellen said, smiling at the memory that had once seemed so fraught with danger and had become, over the years, simply the beginning of everything good in her life. "I thought you were the most stubborn, infuriating man I had ever encountered. And now I think you were exactly the man I needed, even though I did not know it at the time. You saw something in me that day that no one else in this town could see, not even myself. You saw someone worth trusting, worth believing in, worth loving. I do not think I would have become the woman I am today without you standing beside me, believing in my capacity for justice even when others doubted it. You would have found your way regardless," Louis said. "You have always possessed a strength that comes from within, Ellen, a conviction about what is right that no amount of doubt or prejudice could ever have extinguished. I simply had the good fortune to stand beside you while you proved it to the world." They walked home together that evening, through streets that had once seemed so foreign and hostile to Ellen when she first arrived, streets now filled with the warmth of familiarity, of a community she had helped build into something worthy of trust and respect. Their children waited for them at the family home, along with Wade and his wife Constance, and their grandchildren, for Thomas had married and started his own family 2 years prior, filling the extended Yates household with the particular joy that comes from watching a family's legacy continue into a new generation. As the evening wore on, and the celebration continued with music and laughter, and the simple pleasure of a family gathered together in love, Ellen found a quiet moment to step outside onto the porch, gazing up at the vast Texas sky filled with more stars than she could ever hope to count, the same sky that had watched over her through every hardship and triumph of the past quarter century. Louis joined her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and together they stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars, listening to the muffled sounds of their family's celebration drifting through the open windows behind them. "We built a good life here," Louis said softly. "We did," Ellen agreed. "Better than I ever dared to hope for when I first arrived in this town carrying nothing but my brother's shame and my own uncertain future. You did not merely survive that uncertain future, Ellen. You transformed it into something remarkable. You became the very thing this town needed most, someone who could hold both justice and mercy in the same steady hand, someone who understood that true fairness requires seeing the full humanity of every person who stands before judgment. That is a legacy that will long outlast either of us. Ellen turned in his arms to face him, studying the face she had come to know so intimately over more than 2 decades of shared life, a face that had grown only more precious to her with each passing year. "I love you, Louis Yates," she said. "I have loved you since that Sunday beside the creek, and I will love you until my final breath, and I hope, if such things are possible, long beyond that as well." "I love you too, Ellen Barrett Yates," Louis replied, using her full married name with a reverence that made her heart swell. "You have been my partner, my conscience, my greatest joy for 22 years, and I look forward to however many more years God grants us together, watching our children build their own lives, watching our grandchildren grow, growing old together in this town we have called home." They kissed then, beneath that vast Texas sky, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to weather any storm, to overcome any obstacle, to build a life defined not by the shadows of the past, but by the light of hope and love that had guided them forward from that very first difficult meeting. The story of Ellen Barrett Yates and Louis Yates became something of a legend in Concho Springs over the following years, told and retold to new generations of residents who arrived in the growing town. A story of how justice tempered with mercy could transform not only individual lives but entire communities. How love could bloom even in the most unlikely circumstances, between a lawman and the sister of the very outlaw he had once been sworn to capture. Ellen continued to serve as county judge for another 15 years after that 25th anniversary celebration, finally retiring in 1920 at the age of 65. Having presided over more cases than anyone could accurately count, having shaped the judicial character of an entire region through her unwavering commitment to fairness and compassion. Wade lived to see his own grandchildren grow into adulthood. His leather business eventually passed down to his son from his marriage to Constance, a young man who had grown up hearing stories of his father's difficult early years, and had committed himself to honoring that hard-won redemption through his own honest work and community involvement. Louis served as deputy, and eventually as sheriff, for over 3 decades, watching Concho Springs grow from a rough frontier settlement into a proper county seat, before he too retired to spend his remaining years in quiet contentment, alongside the woman who had captured his heart on that fateful autumn morning so many years before. They lived to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary in 1933, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, in a town that had long since forgotten the old prejudices that had once made Ellen's early years so difficult, remembering instead only the legacy of justice and love that she and Louis had built together. Ellen Barrett Yates passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1938, at the age of 83, with Louis beside her, holding her hand just as he had held it on that first day beside the creek when he confessed his love, and just as he had held it through every joy and sorrow of their 55 years together. Louis followed her in death only 8 months later, unable, his family said, to imagine a world without the woman who had given his life such profound meaning and purpose. They were buried together in the Concho Springs Cemetery, beneath a simple stone that bore both their names and a single inscription that Ellen had chosen years before her death, words that captured the essence of the life they had built together against all odds: justice and mercy, forever intertwined. The town of Concho Springs still stands today, grown now into a proper city, but the courthouse where Ellen once rendered her fair and compassionate judgments still bears her name, a lasting testament to the outlaw's sister who became the town's most trusted judge, and to the love story that began with a rifle raised in anger and ended, decades later, with a legacy of justice, mercy, and love that would echo through generations of the community she had helped to build.